What happens when both of you stop reaching out? No texts, no calls, no just checking in. At first it feels calm, almost empowering. You tell yourself, if they wanted to talk, they would. And somewhere on the other side, they're thinking the exact same thing. But here's the truth. No one talks about mutual silence is never neutral. It's not peace. It's not closure. And it's definitely not strength. Silence is a psychological battleground. Every unanswered moment triggers questions. Did I matter? Are they over me? Should I reach out? Or would that make me look weak? And while the outside looks quiet, internally, emotions are getting louder. For some, silence creates curiosity and attraction. For others, it slowly turns into emotional detachment. And the scary part, you usually don't realize which one is happening until it's too late. This single phase, when neither person reaches out, often decides everything, whether connection is reignited or whether two people emotionally walk away without ever saying goodbye. So before you assume silence means nothing, you need to understand what it's actually doing to both of you. And that's where this video begins. At this point, the silence isn't accidental. It's intentional, even if neither person fully admits it. Both people stop reaching out because contact suddenly feels risky. One message could reopen emotions, shift power, or expose vulnerability that neither side feels ready to face. So instead of speaking, both choose distance, hoping the other will make the first move. Ego plays a quiet but powerful role here. Reaching out can feel like admitting loss, like saying, I care more than you do, and no one wants to feel like the one left, holding the emotional weight. So each person waits, convincing themselves that silence equals strength, when in reality it's often fear disguised as control. There's also the assumption factor. Each person believes the other is intentionally staying silent. If they wanted to talk, they would. That thought becomes justification. It turns waiting into a principle rather than a choice. The longer the silence lasts, the harder it becomes to break it, because now there's pride attached to the distance. Emotional self-protection is another reason. Reaching out risks rejection, indifference, or worse, confirmation that the connection no longer matters. Silence feels safer than hearing something that could hurt. For some, not texting is a way to slowly detach without confronting the pain head-on. And then there's timing. Both people often stop reaching out at the same moment, but for different reasons. One might be hoping the silence creates space and longing. The other might be trying to heal or regain control. The intentions don't match, but the outcome does. Nothing happens. This is why mutual silence is so deceptive. It looks like disinterest, but underneath it's unresolved emotion, unspoken thoughts, and two people waiting for reassurance neither is brave enough to ask for. When a man enters no contact, his reaction often isn't immediate emotional collapse, it's mental distancing. At first he tells himself the silence is necessary, even logical. He focuses on routine, distractions, or work, convincing himself that space equals control. This early phase feels calm on the surface because men are often conditioned to suppress emotional processing until later. But silence doesn't remove emotion. It delays it. As days pass, curiosity starts to creep in. He wonders if she's moved on, if the absence affected her at all, or if he misjudged his importance in her life. Because he isn't expressing these thoughts outwardly, they loop internally, gaining intensity. A key shift happens when the lack of contact removes validation. Without messages, reactions, or emotional feedback, his sense of significance starts to feel uncertain. Men often measure emotional connection through interaction, and when that disappears, self-doubt replaces confidence. This is when memories resurface, specific moments, conversations, and small details he once overlooked. There's also a delayed emotional impact unique to male psychology. While women often feel the loss immediately, men tend to feel it later, once the silence becomes permanent rather than temporary. The realization hits when he understands the door may not reopen effortlessly. At this stage, conflict arises between pride and emotion. Reaching out feels like surrendering control, yet staying silent feels like losing something meaningful. If the emotional bond was strong, the silence triggers reflection and longing. If it wasn't, indifference begins to replace curiosity. This is why male silence during no contact is misleading. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. It means he's processing internally, wrestling between attachment, ego, and the fear of being vulnerable in a moment where rejection feels final. Silence affects women differently because emotional awareness often activates immediately. When contact stops, the first response isn't indifference. It's emotional alertness. She feels the absence right away, not just of the person, but of the emotional rhythm that once existed. The silence feels loud, and her mind starts filling in the gaps with meaning, questions, and imagined outcomes. At first, she may analyze everything. Every conversation, every message, every moment is replayed, searching for clues she might have missed. This isn't obsession. It's an attempt to regain emotional clarity. She wants to understand whether the silence is temporary, strategic, or final. Uncertainty is what hurts most, not the lack of communication itself. As time passes, the emotional response shifts. If the silence continues, self-respect steps in. She may want to reach out, but she's also deeply aware of her worth. The internal conflict becomes intense. The desire for connection versus the fear of appearing needy or undervalued. Silence forces her to choose herself or the relationship, and that decision is never easy. There's also an emotional recalibration happening beneath the surface. Without consistent contact, her emotional attachment begins to reorganize. If reassurance doesn't come, her feelings start protecting her. Hope slowly turns into guardedness. Curiosity turns into emotional distance. This is the stage where she might seem fine externally, even empowered, but internally she's building walls, not peace. Importantly, silence often accelerates emotional decision-making for women. While men may linger in uncertainty, women tend to reach a conclusion. Either she feels pulled back through effort and clarity, or she mentally closes the chapter to regain emotional stability. This is why silence is dangerous. If she feels emotionally unseen for too long, detachment isn't a choice, it's survival. By the time she appears over it, the emotional connection may already be gone, not because she stopped caring, but because silence taught her she had to stop waiting. When no one chases, the balance of power doesn't disappear. It quietly reshapes itself. On the surface, it looks equal. Two people holding their ground, neither reaching out, neither giving in, but underneath, power is shifting moment by moment, driven by perception rather than reality. At first, both individuals feel a sense of control. Not texting feels like strength. Silence becomes a statement, I won't be the one who caves. But power based on restraint is unstable. The longer silence stretches, the more it stops being about confidence and starts being about fear. Fear of rejection, fear of losing leverage, fear of confirming the connection mattered more to one person than the other. What truly determines power here isn't who stays silent, it's who is emotionally less attached. The person who can tolerate the silence longer begins to hold the advantage, even if they don't realize it. Meanwhile, the other person may be fighting internal urges, replaying scenarios, and measuring their self-worth against the absence of a message. Silence also removes negotiation. There's no reassurance, no correction, no emotional feedback. Each person fills in the blanks with assumptions, and those assumptions often favor self-protection over truth. Power shifts away from communication and toward interpretation, which is where misunderstandings grow strongest. Ironically, when no one chases, attraction can briefly increase. Distance creates mystery, and uncertainty can amplify desire. But this only works temporarily. If neither side breaks the pattern, mystery turns into emotional disconnection. What once felt like a standoff becomes a quiet exit. True power isn't about who holds out longer. It's about who can communicate without losing self-respect. When silence becomes the only strategy, both people lose influence over the outcome. The connection isn't being tested, it's being left unattended. That's the hidden risk of mutual silence. It feels like a power move, but often it's just two people slowly giving up control to time, pride, and the assumption that if something mattered enough, it wouldn't require anyone to speak first. Silence sits on a thin line between attraction and emotional detachment, and most people don't realize when they cross it. At first, distance can create desire. The absence makes the other person more noticeable, more intriguing. Thoughts intensify, curiosity grows. The mind fills the quiet with imagined moments, and attraction feeds on what's missing rather than what's present. But attraction fueled by silence has an expiration date. Without reinforcement, the emotional bond begins to weaken. What starts as longing slowly shifts into uncertainty. Questions replace desire. Why haven't they reached out? Do I still matter? When those questions go unanswered for too long, the nervous system seeks relief, not through connection, but through detachment. Emotional detachment isn't sudden. It's gradual, almost unnoticeable. It begins when hope gets tired, when anticipation becomes exhausting. The heart doesn't shut down all at once. It adapts. Feelings don't disappear. They lose urgency. The thought of the person no longer sparks emotion, but a quiet resignation. This is where silence changes meaning. Early on, it signals tension, possibility, and unspoken emotion. Later, it signals closure. The same silence that once created attraction now communicates distance, finality, and emotional safety. The shift happens internally, long before it's visible externally. The most dangerous part is timing. One person may still feel pulled by attraction, believing the silence is building tension. The other may already be emotionally stepping back, protecting themselves from disappointment. That mismatch creates irreversible distance. Attraction requires energy, even in absence. Detachment requires none. It's effortless, quiet, and self-preserving. Once detachment takes over, reconnecting doesn't feel exciting. It feels disruptive. This is why silence is a gamble. It can heighten desire or quietly end connection. The difference isn't intention, it's duration. Silence doesn't test attraction, it tests endurance. And the longer no one speaks, the more likely attraction fades, not because the feelings weren't real, but because emotional distance eventually feels safer than waiting. Silence turns into regret the moment it stops feeling intentional and starts feeling irreversible. At first, not reaching out feels like a choice. There's comfort in believing you're in control, that the door is still open and you can speak whenever you want. But over time, silence changes texture. It no longer feels like space. It feels like distance that can't easily be crossed. Regret begins quietly. It shows up as small thoughts you try to dismiss. Maybe I should have said something. Maybe they were waiting for me. These thoughts don't come all at once. They surface during ordinary moments, when distraction fades and honesty sneaks in. The mind starts rewriting scenarios, imagining how different words or timing could have changed everything. What makes regret powerful is uncertainty. You don't regret what you know, you regret what you'll never get an answer to. Silence leaves questions unresolved, and unanswered questions become emotional weight. You wonder whether the other person moved on because they stopped caring or because you never showed you did. There's also the realization of missed emotional closure. Silence robs both people of understanding. No explanation, no final clarity, just assumptions, and assumptions are rarely kind. Over time, the absence of communication becomes its own message, even if that message was never intended. Regret deepens when emotional distance becomes visible. Maybe you see them change, grow, or move forward. Maybe you sense that reaching out now would feel intrusive instead of natural. That's when the silence reveals its cost. The opportunity didn't vanish suddenly. It faded while no one was paying attention. Ironically, regret often arrives when pride no longer matters. When ego finally loosens its grip, the fear of vulnerability feels small compared to the weight of what was left unsaid. But by then the emotional moment has passed. Timing, not feeling, becomes the barrier. This is the hidden danger of mutual silence. It doesn't end things dramatically. It lets them slip away quietly. And regret isn't about losing the person. It's about losing the chance to know what could have happened if someone had spoken before. Silence made the decision for both of them. The biggest mistake people make during mutual silence is believing that doing nothing is the safest option. Silence feels neutral, but it's actually a decision, one that shapes the outcome whether you intend it or not. By avoiding action, people assume they're protecting themselves, when in reality they're surrendering control to time, assumptions, and emotional distance. Another common mistake is treating silence as a strategy instead of a state. Many people stay quiet with the expectation that the other person will eventually break, chase, or miss them enough to reach out. This turns silence into a test, and tests, when unspoken, often fail. The other person may not interpret silence as longing. They may read it as disinterest or closure. People also underestimate how quickly emotions adapt. They assume feelings remain frozen during no contact, waiting to be resumed later. But emotions are dynamic. Without reinforcement, attachment reorganizes itself. What feels intense today may feel distant tomorrow. Waiting too long doesn't preserve connection. It quietly rewires it. Another mistake is letting ego lead instead of intention. Pride convinces people that reaching out equals losing value. But silence driven by ego isn't strength, it's avoidance. True confidence can tolerate vulnerability. Ego, on the other hand, avoids any action that risks rejection, even if that risk is necessary for clarity. There's also the mistake of misreading internal silence as external truth. Just because you're thinking about them doesn't mean they know or feel the same. People assume emotional reciprocity without evidence. Silence provides no feedback, and without feedback, perception replaces reality. Finally, many people wait for the perfect moment to break the silence. They tell themselves they'll reach out when they feel calmer, stronger, or more certain. But emotional timing doesn't wait. By the time they feel ready, the emotional window may already be closed. These mistakes don't come from bad intentions. They come from fear of being exposed, rejected, or disappointed. But silence doesn't eliminate those risks. It only delays them, often until the cost is higher and the connection harder to recover. Eventually, someone often feels the urge to break no contact. But feeling the urge doesn't always lead to action. The desire to reach out usually builds quietly. It starts as curiosity, then turns into restlessness. A thought appears, I wonder how they're doing. That thought repeats, gaining emotional weight each time it returns. Whether someone actually breaks the silence depends on several internal conflicts. One is emotional versus logical thinking. Emotion says, I miss them. Logic responds, if they wanted to talk, they would have already. When logic wins, silence continues. When emotion wins, contact happens, but usually after long hesitation. Another factor is perceived risk. Breaking no contact feels like stepping into uncertainty. There's the fear of no response, a cold response, or a response that confirms emotional distance. For many people, imagined rejection feels worse than real closure, so they choose silence as a form of emotional protection. Timing also matters. People are more likely to break no contact when the silence starts feeling permanent rather than temporary. When hope shifts into loss, urgency appears. Ironically, this often happens too late, after the other person has already begun emotionally detaching. There's also a power calculation happening. Each person wonders who would lose more by reaching out. If one believes they're more invested, they may stay silent to avoid appearing vulnerable. But this calculation is often flawed, because both sides may be thinking the same thing. Sometimes no one breaks the silence, not because the feelings weren't strong, but because fear outlasted emotion. In those cases, silence becomes the ending, not a pause. When someone does break no contact, it's rarely impulsive. It's usually the result of emotional pressure reaching a tipping point. The message is often simple, cautious, and disguised as casual, but beneath it is a need for clarity. So yes, someone often wants to break no contact, but whether they do depends less on love and more on courage. The courage to risk an answer instead of living with uncertainty. Reconnection after mutual silence is possible, but it's far from guaranteed. The chances depend less on timing and more on emotional state, personal growth, and intention. Silence can act as a reset button, giving both people space to reflect, process feelings, and evaluate what they truly want. But it can also act as a barrier, allowing misunderstandings, assumptions, and emotional detachment to solidify. For reconnection to happen, one or both people must move past pride and fear. Silence often amplifies these barriers because it disguises vulnerability as strength. Reaching out requires acknowledging that the connection matters enough to risk uncertainty. That step alone separates reconnection from permanent closure. If neither party is willing to take that risk, the silence simply becomes a quiet ending, not a pause. Timing plays a subtle yet crucial role. Reconnection is more likely when emotional attachment remains strong, and neither person has fully detached. If the silence lasts too long, the emotional bond begins to recalibrate. Attraction may fade, hope may diminish, and what once felt urgent becomes distant. By then, messages that might have sparked dialogue instead feel awkward, forced, or untimely. Closure, on the other hand, often arrives passively. When neither person reaches out, the mind begins to accept absence as reality. Regret may linger, but emotional equilibrium eventually returns. Closure doesn't always require conversation. It happens internally, through reflection and the realization that the connection can no longer be maintained. In some cases, closure can feel even more complete than reconciliation because it's self-generated rather than dependent on another person's action. It's also important to recognize that reconnection and closure aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes people reconnect briefly and then part ways with clarity, turning what could have been lingering uncertainty into understanding. Other times, silence itself is the catalyst for growth, helping each person evaluate whether the relationship aligns with their needs and values. Ultimately, the chances of reconnection or closure hinge on awareness, emotional readiness, and courage. Silence creates an environment for both possibilities, but it doesn't guarantee either outcome. What it does guarantee is a test of patience, reflection, and self-respect, qualities that determine whether a relationship finds new life or quietly concludes. The final truth about mutual silence is that it is never truly neutral. On the surface, it looks like a pause, a break, or even a strategy. But in reality, silence is an active force, shaping emotions, perceptions, and outcomes. It doesn't erase attachment, it transforms it. What starts as anticipation or longing can slowly turn into uncertainty, indifference, or regret, depending on how each person responds internally. Mutual silence exposes the core dynamics of any relationship. It reveals who is attached, who is emotionally resilient, and who prioritizes pride over connection. It strips away distractions and forces both people to confront their feelings honestly, even if that honesty is internal rather than expressed. Every unanswered thought, every unspoken word slowly influences behavior, mindset, and emotional equilibrium. Silence also magnifies assumptions. Without communication, the mind fills in gaps with narratives, sometimes hopeful, sometimes painful. These narratives often carry more weight than reality. People assume the worst, fear rejection, or convince themselves the other person doesn't care. In that sense, silence becomes a mirror, reflecting insecurities, desires, and unspoken truths. The ultimate reality is that silence is a test without instructions. It can either build anticipation and attraction, or it can dismantle connection entirely. Its impact depends on timing, emotional awareness, and the willingness to confront vulnerability. Mutual silence does not guarantee closure, nor does it guarantee reunion. It simply forces the outcome to emerge organically based on actions, choices, and emotional courage. In the end, the lesson is clear. Silence is powerful, but passive. It shapes outcomes quietly, subtly, and often irrevocably. Ignoring it or treating it as neutral is a mistake. Understanding its power allows people to approach it with awareness, deciding whether to maintain it, break it, or use it to create clarity, growth, and emotional self-respect.